Everyone, thank you for coming. As Shelley mentioned, I work with Professor Alka Weber in Behavioral Science and Policy and Simon Levin in Ecology and Evolutionary Biology. And my work that I'll be presenting today focuses on a complex adaptive systems approach to human-environment interactions. And I think rural places that rely on extractive industries show why this kind of approach is useful. So my work is motivated by the seeming contradiction that shows up in places like Appalachia, where despite having these extractive industries that are major economic drivers and very lucrative and often even pay very high salaries, the places that are dominated by these industries tend to have poor outcomes by every metric. So in Appalachian mining counties, you have higher mortality, greater poverty, and in recent decades, high rates of depopulation. And this is not unique to Appalachia. This phenomena is well documented and has been studied on the macro level in economics and has been termed the resource curse. And at the regional level in rural sociology, where these economies have been termed addictive economies. And what these theories generally come down to is that there are some underlying dynamics of how extractive industries shape formal and informal institutions in these places that lead to poor outcomes. And my work is not, the aim is not to prove or disprove these theories, but to explore what they mean for communities that are seeking to transition away from these extractive industries, as will be necessary under a clean energy transition. And what I will show through both modeling and through my qualitative empirical work is that because of these institutional dynamics that tend to reinforce and perpetuate extractive dynamics, it is almost impossible for regions to break out of these cycles of extractivism without serious fundamental transformation to the system structures. So while Appalachia is not unique in these extractive dynamics, it's worth understanding the unique ways that they have manifested in terms of socially, economically, and culturally shaping the region. Appalachia's socioeconomic development has been shaped by extractive industries, whether it's mining or timber, for decades, a century. And in the beginning, it was pretty much developed entirely by these companies in the form of these company towns, in which everything was built and owned by the mining companies. So that the housing, and miners would have to buy everything, including their supplies for mining, from the company store. And so a lot of their salaries went back to the company. And these kind of oppressive working conditions led to labor unrest in the early 1900s, culminating in the Battle of Blair Mountain, which is the largest labor uprising in US history, in which thousands of miners marched on Blair Mountain in an effort to unionize and were bombed by the US government. But in the following decades, the region had a strong labor movement and still have a strong identity as workers. Coal mining also has a strong cultural significance, and the symbols of mining are everywhere. So Mingo Central High School in West Virginia was actually, the construction of it was funded by the coal industry, and their mascot is the miners, and they have a lump of coal that the football team touches for good luck before games. And it's on King Coal Highway. And then the environmental impacts are also very visible in the landscape, especially when you're talking about mountaintop removal, which involves literally, what it sounds like taking the top off a mountain. And as you can imagine, it completely destroys the ecology of that area, destroys the topsoil, and the fill goes into the adjacent valleys and causes issues with downstream floodings flooding, especially in these very narrow river valleys. And they're all, whether mountaintop removal or underground mining leads to issues with water quality and acid mine drainage. And then the health impacts, especially with underground mining, are pretty significant in terms of high risk of silicosis and black lung disease. And so you see high rates of disability and illness in these regions, which is what made them susceptible to the opioid crisis. So as a modeler, my aim is to capture these underlying dynamics through a relatively simple model. And the key dynamic in this model is, as I mentioned, mining has a very dramatic impact on the natural and physical landscape and infrastructure, and these resources that are necessary for alternative industries to arise. And usually it impacts them in a way that makes it very difficult for something other than mining to take place, because it destroys the soil, it destroys the forest, and it makes it hard for alternative livelihoods to take hold. However, their impact is mediated by public institutions. Like regulations on mining or remediation requirements or taxes. But these institutions are themselves influenced by the industry. And I model this through this kind of economic diversity variable, which is influenced by the flow of people between mining and non-mining work, depending on the dynamic payoffs between the two. But what this means essentially is that as mining becomes more dominant economically, these institutions tend to be weakened, which means less of the benefits from mining are captured by these communities and less of the damage is mitigated. And of course, that leads to a cycle, because when the damage isn't mitigated, it makes it harder for alternatives to mining to arise, which further decreases the economic diversity. And so you get a self-perpetuating cycle. And just to show, I won't get into the math of this, but just to show what it looks like, it's a system of 3 ordinary differential equations. So with these 3 state variables, and the rest are intermediary variables. And so it's a fairly simple model, but it produces 2 stable equilibria. And so to understand what I mean by stability and instability, it's helpful to think of it in terms of this kind of ball and cup model, where the bottom of the cups are stable equilibria. This is not the bottom of the cups are stable equilibria, and the top of the hill is an unstable equilibria. So you can imagine if you push the ball a little bit away from a stable equilibria, it will return that stable equilibria. Whereas if it's on top of a hill, it's going to end up going to one of the stable equilibria. And so what the model shows is that there are 2 stable equilibria, depending on your initial conditions. One of which is kind of what I'll call the company town, in that it's dominated by the mining industry. So you have higher levels of mining and very low levels of natural and physical capital, and low levels of non-mining activity. And then in the alternative equilibrium, we still have, where we've maintained these strong institutions, we still have some economic diversity and higher levels of natural and physical capital, and lower levels of mining compared to the other equilibrium. And so what I'm interested in is how this stability landscape changes as you change parameters in the model, which could represent exogenous perturbations on the system, as might happen during an energy transition, for example. And so this plot shows how the stability landscape changes as parameters in the model, in this case, the price of coal, changes. And the curves show how the equilibrium mining level changes with respect to the price. So the solid lines represent stable equilibria, the dashed lines represent unstable equilibria. And so you can see at certain parameter settings, we have two equilibrium, but say that we're in this equilibrium, the diversified equilibrium, and we reduce the price, at some point we get a jump from where we have two stable equilibria to where we only have one. And then because this equilibrium does not lose stability, what happens is we get a kind of hysteresis. So even if we increase the price again, we stay at this equilibrium rather than going back on this trajectory. And what I find is that, and this generalizes to other parameters as well. And in fact, the extractive equilibrium never loses stability while the diversified equilibrium exists for any combination of parameters in the model, which means essentially that transition in the other direction from the company town to the diversified equilibrium does not happen. So, well, this has all been pretty theoretical. My case study work shows how this can manifest in practice. I focused on Central Appalachia, which is like this region, where coal mining has been and still is a pretty large share of employment. And the participants of these interviews are part of local government entities like economic development authorities, environmental justice organizations, or other various nonprofits. But generally in some way they're working on the ground to realize a transition. And in talking with this pretty diverse group of people, there are some pretty significant divisions, but almost everyone we talk to, including those with personal relationships to current or former coal miners, acknowledge that extractive industries were exploitative. And so this quote from an interview describes this history of extractive industries as a wealth grab because all of the value of the whole thing has gone out. And so what that left us as a state is impoverished, especially since the people with power that had the money, they didn't want entrepreneurs, they didn't necessarily want well-educated people, because if you were well-educated, would you crawl 2 miles underground to work all day for nothing? And in this picture, that was pretty illustrative of some of the issues in Appalachia. One of the interviewees we talked to pointed out that house on the hill, which belongs to a coal baron named Don Blankenship, who served several months in prison for a mining accident that killed 29 miners. But this house is only accessible by helicopter, so he has a helipad up there, and he helicopters into his little mansion on a hill, and where he can look down all the surrounding counties, many of which are some of the most economically stressed in the area. I thought it was pretty symbolic. But there's kind of two main narratives that emerge in interviews. One is this idea of jobs at all costs. And so what I hear a lot is that, like in this quote, we are willing to take almost anything. It could be environmentally damaging, or it could be damaging to communities' health. But because we're so desperate for economic growth and revenue, sometimes I feel like we're still willing to sacrifice. And another interviewee mentioned that part of the reason also that they're willing to sacrifice is that there's this common cultural value of really wanting your kids to stay in your home. That's like a sign of success. And that if you only, go along with this, we're going to have jobs and your kids will stay home. And this is actually a narrative that's very much capitalized on by the coal industry. This is a mission statement from the Friends of Coal, which is a faux grassroots organization that was created by the coal industry to advocate for coal. And there's this statement in the mission statement that says, by working together, we can provide good jobs and benefits for future generations which will keep our children and grandchildren close to home. So they very much appeal to this cultural value in trying to push this narrative that coal is the only way to kind of realize these aspirations. But many are kind of pushing back on this idea of a totally jobs and economic development focused approach, and thinking about using the energy transition as an opportunity to make more fundamental changes to the economy and who benefits from it. So this interviewee, for example, mentioned that our energy economy, we have these opportunities, and there was specifically referencing the large amounts of federal funding that are now available. And the problem is, as wonderful as that is, and it genuinely is wonderful, and I think it could be transformational, if not done well, we will simply move from a coal-based extractive economy to a renewable energy economy that still extracts energy, people, and jobs from Appalachia. And here, so this is kind of like pointing out how it's very easy to replicate extractive dynamics because people are desperate and because this region is already kind of regarded as a sacrifice zone. And this is a framework from the Climate Justice Alliance that many organizers refer to as a model for a just transition. And you can see that there are goals like more democratic and regenerative economy with redistribution of wealth and power. So this is all pretty general right now, but my ongoing work is in fleshing out some of the details of what these different pathways can look like and how you can actually realize some of these goals with an empirical model, which would kind of take this theoretical simple model from before and actually kind of breaking out the different possibilities like agriculture, tourism, carbon offsets, and how they interact with the legacies of coal in terms of the natural resources and infrastructure and the institutions that have been shaped by this history. And so this is an example of this work. I produce one of these kind of conceptual maps in each interview as I'm talking with participants, so they kind of help co-create it. And this is kind of to diagram the kind of enablers and barriers to transition. So this one, for example, focuses on community and small scale solar. And one demonstration of the kind of ongoing power of the coal industry is that they passed a bill to basically make it very difficult to shut down or to retire coal-fired power plants. And this was in the Kentucky legislature. And so Kentuckians still have to, even though it's more expensive, they have to, utilities still have to get the energy from coal-fired power plants, instead of opening up space for solar. And on the flip side, cultural attitude towards solar are shifting, and small scale and community solar are actually quite popular and are conceptualized as something that is kind of emancipatory and tangibly beneficial to the community in terms of, you know, who's getting the energy that's generated, and that, you know, the nature of the work requires for labor to be local. But you know, with almost any kind of alternative for the future, it's not, there's no panacea. So utility scale solar, for example, has been described as potentially extractive because developers may come in and build these large systems without any local labor, especially if the people locally don't already have those skills, and no benefits to the community. And this is especially the case because these communities typically lack the political power to kind of contest these projects, and they don't really have a need to really negotiate with them. So I think this is why it's important to kind of really take into account the context and the kind of material specificities of the technology at hand in terms of understanding how they shape a transition and whether it would be just. So I hope to have shown the value of kind of combining modeling for generalizable insights with the more contextualized qualitative place-based work. In terms of understanding why it's so hard to get out of this trap of extractivism and the importance of going beyond solely technological or top-down interventions. And really take seriously these kind of grassroots, bottom-up movements and stakeholder engagement. And in particular, to treat the residents of these communities as the experts in terms of knowing what needs to happen in their communities. Thank you.
About 8 minutes for questions. And we do have one person on Zoom. So, Dorian, if you have any questions, please go ahead and put them in the Q&A.
Thank you very much for the talk. My question is about like the relationship between your qualitative work and your modeling work. So like you touched on this a bit, but like, are you using the qualitative work to like inform how you make your models, or what exactly is that like linkage like?
Yeah, so at this point, like with the theoretical model, it was more just, I was creating it as I was doing these interviews, so it informed the structure of the model. I mean, it's also based on like literature and stuff. But at some point, I'm going to build a more empirical model, like, you know, taking these conceptual maps and translating them to an actual mathematical model.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Okay.
At this point, they're like still kind of separate.
I see. Cool.
So in that approach, how would you, there's a lot of potential, you know, variables or, you know,
Yeah,
so in that approach, how would you identify? You think the key pieces to take out of the qualitative work and put it into the
yeah, so that's why I'm kind of like still kind of using that basic framework from the specific model, so I'm kind of focusing on these categories of variables. And so like, you know, community and small scale solar being like, here's the alternative industry, but what are the things that it needs in order to take off? And so it's like, oh, this is people infrastructure, and how does that kind of interact with institutions like local government, and utility company. So I don't know if that makes sense, but like those are the main kind of categories of variables that I'm focusing on. In terms of like the institutions and infrastructure enabling things like community and small scale solar to exist.
Have there been any, have there been any, rumors or anything about how they could use the space and the ruins of the mountaintop removal? Like for utility scale stuff?
Yeah, that's actually a pretty popular proposal. Well, in general, anything that makes use of that space is a hot topic right now in the region. But it's kind of difficult. Well, so one idea is that because these are like flat spaces in a region where there's not much flat land, that it's useful for like setting up, you know, large scale solar projects. The only issue is I've heard that the land might not necessarily be like stable enough for large scale installations. The other thing that some people are trying to use those spaces for is well, there's a couple things. One is I forget what it's called. Those vehicles that you drive around. Oh my God. ATVs. ATV tourism is big right now in parts of West Virginia. And so they are using some of these sites for ATV trails. And then the other thing is it's kind of tough because the soil isn't great, but there are efforts to reforest these areas, and it makes for it's useful for like carbon offsets because you know that it wasn't sequestering carbon before and then you put a forest there. So that's one of the kind of ideas to make that land useful.
And I guess they couldn't use it for like community solar if they're making them pay for coal with these laws and stuff that you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, that's the other thing is like, well, usually the coal industry is happy to have people like use it, so that they don't have to remediate it themselves. But that is one of the things, is like having to negotiate with the coal industry for access to the land, but they still own like the mineral rights. So those things are actually separate, and it does make getting the land in order to be able to do any of these things very difficult, because most of the land is owned by the coal industry, as are the mineral rights. And so even if you buy some land, they could still like be like, oh, we want to extract the coal from there, down the line, so.
The coal that's currently mined, is that entirely for power production or does it?
Not all, I mean, most of it is my understanding, but some of it is metallurgical. Coal.
And is that used in these areas or does it go elsewhere?
It goes elsewhere.
So it's not entirely a question of replacing coal-fired power with renewable.
Right,
This-
well, not just like in this region, because most of it's going elsewhere, but, yeah, but also, energy transition isn't the only reason why coal mining is declining in this region. It's also that extracting the coal is more expensive because they've been mining it for a long time, and a lot of the coal mining has moved out west, places like Utah.
Got one last question. And you said that so is all of the mining land owned by the companies, or is any of it leased from the federal government or the state governments?
My understanding is that at least the vast majority of it's actually owned by the mining industry.
Okay.
Yeah, and in some places it's like quite a lot, like one of the counties we were in, 80% of the land was owned by the mining or by an extractive industry.
That's a challenge.
Yeah.
All right. Please join me in thanking this study. Our next speaker is Dr. Nathan Wade. Nathan earned his BS in Mechanical and Aerospace Engineering here at Princeton and has a Master's in Mechanical Engineering from Stanford University. Subsequently, he earned his PhD from Caltech in the Department of Graduate Aerospace Laboratories. His thesis research involved a variety of different approaches to understand how unsteady and chaotic atmospheric flows affect power generation from wind turbines. Nathan joined Princeton in 2023 as a Distinguished Postdoctoral Fellow at the Amlinger Center, working with Professor Marcus Holtmore. And this fall, he'll be moving to UPenn as an assistant professor in what department?
Mechanical engineering.
In mechanical engineering. All right, but before he leaves, he's going to present some of the work that he's done here, which is using some lab and field-based approaches to explore atmospheric dynamics relevant to wind power at a pretty high resolution. And he'll turn it over to Nathan. Please join me in welcoming.
Thanks so much, Charlie, and thanks for all of you for being here and for the opportunity to share a little bit about the stuff I've been doing in the past year as a postdoc here. And this extends to the vision that I want to pursue in my faculty position at UPenn. This is going to be a very schematic talk, so I'm not going to go into the details. If you're a detail-oriented person, I'm sorry, but I'm happy to chat afterwards with more specific information. But basically, to start us off, the research interests that I've been pursuing broadly explore how engineering systems interact with the atmosphere. Because the atmosphere is all around us, and it affects basically almost every aspect of life on our planet, including power extraction from renewable energy resources, regional ecology, like how birds and pollinators and things like that interact with the environment, air quality in cities, as well as more severe climate impacts such as storms and wildfires. And so as we continue to grapple with the effects of climate change worldwide, especially in their impacts on the environment and on vulnerable populations, I think it's increasingly important for us to understand how the atmosphere is coupled with the things that we as humans do. And the issue with that is that these interactions are very complex. As you can see in this schematic here of length scales and time scales in the atmosphere is a very sort of broad place. We have very, very small airflow motions that occur on the scale of almost millimeters. That's generally very close to the ground. Then obviously you go all the way up to global circulation on the scale of the planet. And because all the air is kind of a one connected fluid, this is all coupled together in this big giant chaotic mess, which makes it fun to study. What you'll notice in this plot here is that the activities that we pursue as humans generally occur in this intermediate range of scales, which I call the sub-mesoscale range. That's generally from, say, on the order of meters up to kilometers or tens of kilometers, so like neighborhood scale dynamics. And so if we want to understand how engineering systems and enterprises interact with local ecosystems, we have to understand and characterize these sub-mesoscale atmospheric dynamics. Which is all good and fine until we look at what we can currently do. And we see that there's a challenge in capturing these dynamics with traditional lab and field experiments, which are limited based on the size of the things that they can capture, just because these motions are very large. And even high resolution simulations can struggle with the large sort of volumes and the complexity of the problem. The computational cost scales very poorly. Then on the big end, we have these local and regional weather models, but their resolution is too coarse to capture effectively a lot of the dynamics that happen in this intermediate range of scales. And so this combined problem has been termed for a number of years as like the terra incognita of atmospheric science, just because it's very important and also very hard to see what happens in this regime. And so that's exactly what I've been trying to focus on in my work here, as well as going forward. I want to understand how we can better measure and characterize atmospheric flows at the full scale in this flow regime, and how they affect both engineering systems and also the environment more broadly. In the work that I've done here, I've contributed to 3 different ways of approaching this goal. One at the lab scale, using some innovative wind tunnels that we have here at Princeton, and then also using some more field-oriented measurement techniques using particles and eventually drone-based sensors. And so the hope is that this ensemble of techniques will allow us to directly investigate some of these previously unknown physics, and then use that knowledge to design and optimize for the next generation of renewable energy systems as we go into the clean energy transition. So diving right in, we'll start off by talking about a way that we've looked at to try to understand how do we get these really, really big flow problems squeezed down into a laboratory setting. Say we want to study the dynamics of a large wind turbine. The largest offshore turbines are like 150 to 200 meters in diameter, so like massive things. If you want to do that, fluid mechanics gives you a nice tool, and that's called the Reynolds number or Reynolds number scaling. This is a non-dimensional parameter that consists of your fluid density, your velocity, and a length scale divided by the dynamic viscosity, or how sticky your fluid is. And basically, if you have 2 different flows, so like a flow in the real world and then a flow in the lab, if you're able to mess with those parameters and match the Reynolds number, that allows you to match the fluid mechanics. And so then you're actually studying the same dynamics, even though your system has different sort of combinations of these variables. Now, the issue is in conventional wind tunnels, you have a constant air density. And so if you want to scale something like a 150 meter diameter turbine down to like a 15 centimeter, like banana sized model, that's 1,000 times difference in size. And so this trade-off in the Reynolds number means that the velocity is going to have to increase by a factor of 1,000, puts your little wind turbine at about like Mach 10 or Mach 15. Obviously, wind turbines in the real world are not supersonic unless something goes very wrong. So this is generally just, you have to accept that your Reynolds numbers are going to be lower, which means you're inhibited in terms of what you can say about the real world applicability of your experiments. However, you'll notice I conveniently neglected to talk about the density. So if we now add that back in and say we compress the air to something like 170 times atmospheric pressure, now we can boost the Reynolds number for the same size scale model so that the effective diameter of your turbine is now something more like 25 meters, which again is not necessarily the full size, the full scale of a turbine, but we're a lot closer than we can get with conventional measurement techniques. So in order to do this, we conveniently have at the Forrestal campus at Princeton a number of the world's only operational high pressure wind tunnels. This is an example here. We call it the high Reynolds number testing facility because we test at high Reynolds numbers. Whoever named it was not that creative. But it's a closed loop wind tunnel, so the flow will kind of come out along this side and then it'll come back here. And in the middle section where you see that chimney, there's installed currently a wind turbine. So 15 centimeter diameter rotor, there's a measurement stack there that's hanging down in the inset. And then you can see if you invert that picture, that's what's pointing up in that little chimney that you see there. So large scale facility, we can pressurize it to 170 atmospheres, run it at a wind speed of up to 10 meters per second. For most of our experiments, we run it at 4. That gives us a Reynolds number of 4 million, which is pushing towards that Reynolds numbers of full utility scale wind turbines, which are generally 10 to the 6 or 10 to the 7. We're able to measure forces and power pretty easily. And then using a nanoscale flow sensor that the lab has developed, we can put that on a traverse and kind of move it around behind the turbine. And that tells us something about the flow fields in the wake of the turbine. So I won't go into details here, but I want to just mention a couple of the things that we've been doing with this kind of facility and the scientific questions that we can answer. So these are some active projects that have to do not only with the power the turbine produces, which is obviously important, but what the turbine does to the downstream flow. So in this image, you see this is a photograph of an actual offshore wind farm, and you can see the turbine wakes shown by these condensation sort of clouds behind the first row of turbines. That happens because the turbine extracts power from the flow, and then there's a low pressure and low velocity region behind the turbine that takes some time to recover back to the full wind speed. So you can see if flow is coming in from sort of the lower left, these front row turbines are doing just fine. They have a nice clean wind to generate power from, but these poor, unfortunate turbines in the back are sitting right in the wakes. And overall, the aggregate power of this entire wind farm, because of these wake losses, can go down by about 40% in some cases. So this is something that we want to figure out how to avoid in the real world. And so one thing that we've been looking at involves, looking at if we can move these wakes away from those turbines, not just by moving the turbines around because they're kind of fixed in place, but also by actually steering the wake off to the side. And so this was a project that was started by a former lab mate in my PhD lab. If you slightly misalign the turbine, that creates a force on the wake in the sideways direction, and that pushes the entire wake over, as you can see in this artist's rendition, so that your turbines 2, 3, 4, etc. in the row are now experiencing a cleaner wind speed and can generate more power. And we've shown in our experiments as well that this actually occurs at these realistic flow conditions and Reynolds numbers. Another way that you can mess with the wake is by actually forcing the wake so that it breaks up faster, so that by the time it gets to your downstream turbine, there's more momentum available in the wake. So this is work that came out of my, that I've been working on since finishing my PhD, where we surge the turbine back and forth. The wind's coming in this direction. You can see the wake in this blue sort of region here. And you can see that as we move the turbine back and forth, the wake starts to kind of bunch up and form these waves, which then break the wake down faster and give you about 15% more power available to the downstream turbines. This is applicable for floating offshore wind, but a lot of turbines are not moving around, again, unless something goes horribly wrong. And so something that we've looked at in the HRTF here at Princeton is, rather than move the turbine back and forth, if you change the rotation rate in a time varying sort of oscillatory manner, you can generate similar waves. And this is wind tunnel data that we took in the high pressure wind tunnel. And I'll note again, this is over a order of magnitude larger in terms of Reynolds number than the traditional experimental methods that most people in fluid mechanics can use. So the hope is that these experiments will be able to tell us something useful about the effectiveness of these wake control mechanisms for actual full-scale turbines. So you can test them on these little models and you don't have to build a massive turbine and run the experiments in the field. So the overall idea behind these high pressure facilities is they're very useful and valuable for probing at these large scale fluid mechanics in a controlled setting. But after a year of working in them, I can also say that they're extremely costly if you don't just have them lying around. And they also have significant limitations in terms of what you can measure. So concurrently, in addition to this, we've also been working on ways to measure atmospheric dynamics in their sort of natural habitat. So going into the field and actually probing out what actually is going on in the atmosphere. So moving away from the lab now and into the field, generally flow measurements in the atmosphere are just a lot harder because you're out in the weather, it's raining, it's snowing, birds are flying and attacking your device, whatever. And so anemometry and sensing of velocities is generally sort of very restricted. So for example, you have these cup anemometers that you might have built in a science fair project as a kid. They can measure one component of the wind speed. The more advanced version is this ultrasonic anemometer, which gives you the 3-component wind vector. The issue with these is that they end up being placed at a single point, often on a meteorological tower like this one here. And once you have them set, they take measurements, right? But if you want to get the measurements, say like a meter that way, or, you know, say a kilometer downstream, there's no way you're moving that tower easily. And by the time, even if you could move the tower, the flow will have changed and you're not measuring the same flow. So we want to think about ways in which we can characterize the full 3-dimensional volumetric behavior of these turbulent flows, particularly with the application of wind energy in mind. And to do that, we would ideally have a sensor that can move with the flow, tell you exactly where the flow is doing. And if you could distribute a whole bunch of them through your volume, then you would have velocity measurements kind of wherever you want. This is a very high-tech piece of technology that you may have encountered in the past. It's called a soap bubble. And so what people in the lab, particularly Nick Conlin and Hannah Evan, who've been working on this project for a while, they developed this little bubble generator that produces small, neutrally buoyant bubbles that you can then track. And by understanding where the bubbles are going, if they're following the flow well, then you should understand what the flow is doing. And so we looked to test this. This is an example of kind of a setup that we used. You have a bubble generator upstream. You release these bubbles, which are the little circles in this plot, and you light the bubbles up with spotlights. And then you put cameras around your measurement domain and you can triangulate where the bubbles are going. If you know their positions, then you can understand, you can differentiate that and get their velocity. So this is an example that Nick made of how this works. You see the bubbles advecting through the domain and they get tracked by the cameras. This is called Lagrangian particle tracking or particle tracking velocimetry. This allows us to get a volume of close to 10 meters square and then 4 meters in the vertical direction. And as you remember from the introductory plot that I showed, this is sort of well into at least the smaller end of the sub-mesoscale range that we're trying to probe at. We decided at first to look at the atmospheric surface layer, which is the lowest part of the atmosphere, just because 1, it's easy to access, and 2, because this is really critical for transfer between the ground and the air, surface fluxes and things like that. So we had to go test this somewhere out in the field, and so we went to this nice idyllic location. This may look like an isle in the Caribbean, but it's actually the Jersey Shore. It's 2 hours drive from here. So we drove out to the beach, we set up our system on this kind of spit of land so that the flow, the wind speed is coming in off the water, and you have this nice sort of atmospheric boundary layer that develops right on the beach. This is a photograph of what it looked like. We run these tests at night so the bubbles light up nicely. We've got our LEDs here. We also had 2 ultrasonic anemometers to give us sort of like a ground truth for what's going on in the flow that we could compare to what we see with our bubbles. We generate the bubbles, they fly downstream, we catch them with the cameras. And yeah, this is what it kind of looks like. If that's playing well on the screen, you can see the bubbles coming from right to left, they're following the wind. And then they go off into the night. So we had wind speeds of around 2.5 meters per second. And just to give you a sense of what we can do with this technique, I'll compare the bubble tracks, which we were able to find with post-processing. So these are like individual bubbles colored by their speed. And then we can also calculate the turbulent statistics of the flow from these ultrasonic anemometers that we had on site. And just to compare what we can see, you look at the turbulent timescales and the length scales, so pretty fast time scales and length scales on the order of a millimeter, compared to what we can capture with the bubbles. So if you look at the frame rate of the cameras, you see that we're framing much faster than the estimated turbulent time scale. So we have good temporal resolution. We also can get a good spatial resolution based on the size of the bubble. So we're within an order of magnitude of the smallest scales in the flow, but we can also get all the way up to sort of 10-meter scale. So we have a large range of both temporal and spatial scales that we can use to look at turbulence statistics and understand more of the fundamental physics of this problem. So what do we see? These are, the quantities aren't as important, but this is just comparing the bubble system, the open circles, to the sonic anemometers, sort of our quote unquote ground truth. And these, the black points are just those two sonic point measurements. You can see that there's very good agreement between these mean quantities. And then if we look at the variances, so the fluctuations as well, we're also seeing basically spot on agreement in the three components of the velocity. The difference is that for the bubble system, we're getting, again, these volumetric measurements. So you have these large this large volume of points that you can sample compared to the 2 points that you get with the sonic anemometers. And so this means this is a much more versatile technique for measuring these sorts of three-dimensional volumetric flows. And so I think this technique has a lot of potential, not only for sort of your fundamental studies of atmospheric turbulence, but also for those wind turbine wake studies that I mentioned previously. Work that I kind of was involved in early on in my PhD was field experiments using a similar kind of system that used artificial snow particles instead of bubbles. And so you can see in the video on the right, this is looking up at the base of a vertical axis wind turbine, that these snow particles are advected past the turbine, and you can see them swirl around in the wake. We could track them and see what the 3D structure of the turbine wake looks like. These were limited in many senses because these snow particles were not really well behaved in the flow. And so I think the combination of this new bubble system that we've developed and efforts to scale the system up to get larger and larger volumes can allow us to capture more of these sorts of higher Reynolds number conditions for wind energy applications directly in actual operating wind farms, with all of their three-dimensional complexity and chaos and all the fun stuff that we fluids nerds like to look at. So lastly, you'll notice that the things that we've covered in the high pressure wind tunnels and this field technique are sort of pushing at like the, I guess, 10-meter kind of scale in terms of diameter or in terms of length scales. But ultimately we want to push towards the far end of that sub-mesoscale regime, right? So like kilometers to 10-kilometer scale. Both of those methods are going to start to be limited just based on size and practical constraints. And so one of our thoughts was if you don't have to track your bubble or your particle optically, and instead the particle tracks itself in sort of like a smart manner, then you can send your particle out over kilometers or whatever, and it can report back all of its data without you having to follow it manually. And so that's what motivated us to look at drones as sort of smart particles. This is an example of a very lightweight drone called a Crazy Fly. It's 40 grams. And what the idea behind this thing, which we call Ladrone, short for Lagrangian drone, is we only tell the drone to offset its own gravity. And so it basically just hovers, but that means if you hit it with a gust disturbance, it should kind of be knocked away and fly with that gust disturbance. And if you have basically centimeter scale GPS tracking on it, the drone can log its position and as well as its accelerations, and you can figure out, sort of back out what its trajectory is, and from there infer something about the fluid mechanics. This is, I should mention, this was spearheaded by Nate Simon and Skywalker Lee from Ani Majumdar's group. Nick and Girgis and I kind of provided some of the fluid mechanics side of things. So this was an experiment we ran in a wind tunnel at Forrestal, which is, you can't see it, but it's here. We turn it on right at this instant, and that creates a gust that then propagates along here. We got the bubbles floating around so that we can see what the flow is doing. And you can see that the bubbles kind of accelerate as the gust hits it. And the drone flies along with them. The velocities around the drone are plotted in blue. The velocity of the drone is plotted in red. You can see that they don't match up perfectly, but the drone is following sort of what the flow is doing, just with this kind of offset. So work in progress, there's still more to be done here, but it's a step in the direction of developing these flow sensors at the intersection of robotics and fluid mechanics that can help us unlock these larger scale atmospheric motions. So just to sum up, we've talked about the lab scale measurements that we can do to study wind turbine wakes. We've talked about field scale measurements to study atmospheric turbulence and also the wakes of wind turbines in the field. And then we're pushing out this envelope towards filling out the submesoscale regime in atmospheric dynamics. And what's the overall takeaway, besides that we've had a lot of fun with fluid mechanics and robots and things, is that if we can better understand how these atmospheric phenomena are coupling in with the things that we as humans do, we can then start to think about ways in which we can do actual real-time sensing and flow mapping for things like wind farm siting or ventilation in buildings or local weather prediction. All of these very complex things that are very difficult to do in the real world because the atmosphere is such a large, chaotic place. And the last thing I'll mention is that particularly these field scale techniques that we've been developing, we're working with off-the-shelf technologies and relatively inexpensive parts. And the hope is that because so much of the world that's most affected by the harmful influences of climate change are areas that are traditionally under-resourced, if we can develop some of these technologies that can be then picked up and used by these areas, we can equip these populations to better design their new facilities as they think about clean energy transitions so that they can be more climate resilient, more atmosphere aware, and eventually more sustainable. So that's all I've got for you today. I again mentioned that this is a work that's a sort of combination effort between a whole lot of people in various groups, including Marcus Holtmark's group, Ellie Bouzed's group, and Ani Majumdar's group. And I'm happy to take any questions on any of the specifics, but you can also find some of that information on my website, which is linked there. Thanks for your attention.
So I have two questions. One is, how far apart are roughly our wind turbines in an offshore farm versus our onshore farm? And, you know, relative to the length scales that you're working at experimentally measured.
Right, so they generally are somewhere between 5 to 10 turbine diameters, depending on the farm. I think earlier ones, some of the ones you see out in California, these big ones, they're a little bit more closely spaced because they didn't quite appreciate this. And they just made them all in these nice perfect lines in the wind direction, which means that the downstream turbines are just getting beat up by the waves. So in terms of physical units, it's sort of on the order of like half a kilometer
Okay,
spacing.
and so at let's say for the bubble experiment, to what extent could you take that first measurement of, you know, over 24 feet or 30-ish feet? Could you take that first measurement of the turbulences it's developing and predict what it looks like using models further down? I mean, as opposed to building a giant experimental system?
Yeah, that's a good question, sort of, and Ellie and I have talked about like doing multiple sort of like little boxes and then finding correlations between the two. So I think there are definitely ways in which you can use the domain that you have. And also another thing I've thought about is using large, like basically high fidelity simulations that rely on models. So you're not exactly sure how they apply to the atmosphere, but if you can use data assimilation to calibrate them with some of these direct measurements, then maybe you can do that sort of larger scale flow field prediction and virtually extend your domain to include things like, you know, sort of multiple turbines in a wind farm.
Yeah, or building lengths in a
Exactly,
microclimatology.
exactly.
Anybody else?
What does it mean for your bubbles to be mutually buoyant? Does that mean?
So basically, if you fill them with helium, right? And so if they're neutrally buoyant and there's no air movement, they'll just sit in the air. The snow particles, for example, are not filled, they're just filled with air, so it's this kind of foam thing. And if you put them into still air, they'll fall down. And so the response to the flow, if you want it to follow the flow, you don't want it to be doing its own thing with gravity, you want it to just be floating along.
The helium is lighter than air, so
Yes.
that offset the weight of the
The soap, exactly, yeah.
So that seems tricky. Getting the right balance of.
Exactly, yeah, so Nick and Hannah were very hard at work designing a generator that you could control the feed rates of the helium and the soap so that you would get neutral buoyancy.
So then I have one more question about that
Yep.
too, which is, where the bubbles are released. Cause you mentioned maybe it's 4 meters high was the experimental volume.
Mhm.
Or height. Is there a bubble, is there like a tower that's releasing bubbles at different heights? Is that what's going on?
Yeah, I think this slide should show it. Where is it? Oops, sorry, I'm back. We basically had a little, like, this is just a photo that I took. So you're standing behind the bubble generator and you release the bubbles basically at like my nose height.
Okay.
And the 4 meters comes from turbulence is very good at mixing and spreading things, and so the bubbles kind of disperse and then fill the volume by the time they get to the volume.
Well, how far away is the experiment
It's
from the?
about, say, 10-15 meters, I think.
Okay.
The other annoying thing in the field is that your wind direction you can't control, and so we set everything up perfectly, we were ready to take data, then the wind shifted, so we had to move everything over by a couple of feet. Yeah,
What illuminates? What illuminates just a very bright light as well?
yeah, we had a LED, like basically LED spotlights that we set up on the ground.
And the bubble soap is just enough to.
Yeah, you
reflect
basically,
that.
you get these little glare points, in the bubbles, and they light up like Christmas lights, it's pretty convenient.
Does the turbulence happening in offshore or also onshore, and at what speed typically? And does that also happen in the vertical turbine?
Yes, it's a good question. So turbulence is, one of my professors in grad school likes to say, turbulence is the rule, not the exception. So the atmosphere is almost always turbulent and very rarely nice and smooth. So turbulence happens above the ground. It also happens above the ocean with sort of ocean waves helping to contribute to that. It happens when the horizontal axis turbine blades slice through the air, they generate turbulence. When the vertical axis turbine blades slice through the air, they also generate turbulence. So part of the difficulty is because turbulence is this like famous unsolved problem, and it happens everywhere at these scales. Even just measuring it is sort of the challenge that we're trying to push towards. And then the question is, how do you model it? And how do you understand it? And then how do you actually leverage what you know to further optimize your systems?
There any way to like, other way to shrink the wake, kind of like what they do on golf balls with dimples?
Yeah, there's various ways of, this is things I want to look at as well, like with the turbine, you can't like put dimples on the turbine easily, because the wake is basically set by the length of the blade, and so if you want to shrink the wake, you would make the blade smaller, then you get less power. But there are things you can do by pitching the blades, is a control axis that we haven't tried, but other people have looked at. And then also for offshore turbines, you can look at sort of tilting the rotor, right? Especially for a floating offshore turbine, if it's kind of free to move, then you have a whole bunch of degrees of freedom that you can play with. So those are things that we're hoping to actively look at in the future.
Yeah, so with the bubbles, you're able to just constantly be shooting them out, basically, because they're not doing anything. But with the drones, if you have a bunch of these drones next to each other, they're gonna be interfering with each other's flows, right?
Yes.
So how far apart would you need, like, how much space do you need to give them, and how high up do they need to be?
It's a good question. I mean, basically, these little drones are sort of, like less than 10 centimeter scale. I think if they're only like a couple of body lengths apart from each other, then they're generally fine. It's the prop wash underneath the drone that you want to worry about. And so if you're trying to measure flows on the scales of kilometers, like you don't really want your drones to be that close anyway. If they do, they might bump into each other. So you would release them at different times or different sort of spacing intervals, and they shouldn't really interfere with each other, is the hope. But again, who knows what'll happen in the field.
All right. Thank you.